break that heart of stone. He knows exactly how to do it. I guarantee, and if you allow him to, you will have life and have it abundantly. When you give up your will and your way, guess what? You get God's will and God's way. And that's so much greater. So much greater. So, that's what we've learned. The story shows this is something I didn't go over last time. The story also shows one of the 4 sins that cry to heaven for vengeance. We don't hear much about this, but it's something that has not left the catechism. And in this case, the sin that cries to heaven is murder of the innocent. Okay? So, Catechism, paragraph 1867. I want to go over here. This is under the title, The Gravity of Sin, Mortal and Venial. 1867 says, the catechetical tradition also recalls that there are sins that cry to heaven. The blood of Abel, yes, it cried to heaven. The sin of the Sodomites, that cried to heaven. The cry of the people oppressed in Egypt, yes. And the cry of the foreigner, the widow, and the orphan, injustice to the wage earner. Okay? So these have been, what do these sins translate into? The blood of Abel, what does that cry to heaven for? It's the murder of the innocent. Abel did not deserve to be killed by his brother, but his blood cried out to heaven for vengeance. The martyrs in the book of Revelation, chapter 6, are under the throne of God, crying out for revenge for their deaths because they were unjustly killed. That is a sin that cries to heaven for vengeance. May we all have mercy on us for that. What is the sin of the Sodomites? The sin of their depravity. Okay? In the book of Ezekiel, chapter 16, verse 49, if I'm not mistaken, says that the sin of Sodom was this: they were proud, they were immoral, and they cared nothing for the poor. That was their sin. Let me see if I can find it real quick. Jeremiah, Ezekiel 16:49. 49. Yes, Ezekiel 16:49. Behold, this was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had pride, fullness of food, and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and the needy. They were haughty and did abominable things before me. Therefore, I removed him when I saw it. That's the sin that cries to heaven. That's what caused their destruction. That's what God said. Did you hear what he said? Let's hear it again. What was their problem? They had pride. Did you hear that? That was the chief sin of Sodom, pride. They were full of themselves, you could say. The second is the fullness of food. Did you hear that? They were wealthy. They forgot about God. They had all that they need. Fullness of themselves, fullness of food. And he repeats it. They were prosperous and had ease. They were haughty, another synonym for pride. So pride is mentioned twice in the sin of Sodom. Okay? And did abominable things before me. Those are the immoral acts that they did. The rape, or the attempt of raping the two angels that came. Remember that? That's part of the abominable acts. But beyond that, that was their pride and their abundance of wealth. And where was that? And they did not aid the poor and the needy. So they were so full of themselves they didn't care less about anyone else that was less than them. That is the sins that cry out to heaven. You hear that? And the chief among them is pride. We cannot underestimate that. Pride. The cry of the oppressed in Egypt. Remember when the children of Israel were slaves with Pharaoh and he beat them and sent them taskmasters and all of that? Their cries, it said, went up to heaven. What does this translate into? It translates into mistreatment of others. Mistreatment of others. The marginalized, those that are not on the upper parts of society. Specifically in terms of Egypt, the slaves of Egypt, the mistreatment of them by Pharaoh. But in general, we can say the mistreatment of people that are outside of the upper echelons of society. So the poor, the marginalized, again, the mistreatment of them is a sin that cries to heaven. The cry of the widow, the foreigner, and the orphan. Again, this kind of goes with the first one. Anyone that has no one to defend for themselves. They have no one to fend for them. No one to support them. Okay? They're on their own. The widow has no one to support her. The orphan has no parents. There's no one in their corner. When you oppress these types of marginalized people, it's a sin that cries to heaven because it's a mistreatment. And the third is injustice to the wage earner. Now, I want to see what this one for you. Yes, this is from the Catechism. Deuteronomy 24:14. I want to see that. This is what the Catechism, I want to see exactly what this is. Deuteronomy 24:14 and 15. Brace yourself. You shall not oppress a hired servant who is poor and needy, whether he is one of your brethren or one of your sojourners who are in your lands within your towns. You shall give him his hire on the day he earns it, before the sun goes down, for he is poor and sets his heart upon it, lest he cry against you to the Lord, and it be a sin to you. So mistreatment of your workers, those in your hire, is a sin that cries to heaven for vengeance. It has to do with injustice. It's injustice. The other verse is James 5:4. I have a feeling I know what this one is. James has a lot to say about treating everyone equally in the church. And if you treat those who are of a lower class differently than in the church, that's a big blight on the church. You should treat everyone with equanimity, regardless of their social status. And James 5:4 says, behold, the wages of the laborer who mows your fields, which you keep back by fraud, cry out, and the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of your host. You have lived on earth in luxury and pleasure. You have fattened your hearts in the day of slaughter. You have condemned, you have killed the righteous man, he does not resist you. Come now, you rich, weep and howl for your miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches have rotted, and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have rusted, and the rust will be evidence against you, and it will eat your flesh like fire. You have laid up treasure for the last days. So again, this is injustice towards those in your hire. Okay? So that's what they're meaning here. So these are the sins that cry out to God for justice, vengeance. So it's not, and the first one that we dealt with is the sin that Cain committed against Abel, the murder of the innocent. Okay? Cain is banished. Adam and Eve have a third son named Seth. This sets the scene for the rest of the narrative of Genesis. At the end of Genesis 4, we end up with 2 lineages. And in fact, Genesis chapter 5 is nothing but a genealogy of the descendants of Cain and the descendants of Seth. And they're both presented together. So you have all of Seth and his children. You have Cain and all of his children. What you have here are the godly men and women that followed after Seth. And you have all the ungodly men and women that followed after Cain. And this reaches a crescendo in Genesis chapter 6. And this is the beginning of the story of Noah. So what we've learned from Genesis from the very beginning is that God is setting up a theme that is going to be repeated for the rest of the story. There are 2 roads. There is the road of the ungodly, and there is the road of the godly men and women. Okay? When we get to the book of Revelation, this makes it very clear. The book of Revelation puts it this way. Revelation chapter 12 says, chapter 13, when the dragon saw that he had been thrown down to earth, he pursued the woman who had borne the male child. But the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly from the serpent into the wilderness, where she'll be nourished for a time, times and a half time. Then the dragon was angry with the woman, and went off to make war on the rest of her offspring, those who keep the commandments of God and bear the testimony of Jesus. Then it goes on, and he stood on the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rising out of the sea with 7 heads and 10 horns. And then later on in verse 11, we see another beast rising out of the earth. And so what do we see here? In the book of Revelation, in a dramatic way, we have the lineage of the woman and the male child, those who keep the commandments of God and follow the testimony of Jesus, the godly line. And then we have those that follow the dragon, and those are the Antichrist and the false prophet, and all of those who followed him. So you see in the book of Revelation this distinguishment between 2 separate roads. And this is what we see in the book of Genesis at this point. You see the godly line of Seth and his followers, and the ungodly line of Cain and his followers. And the rest of the narrative of Scripture is pointing out those that follow God on one path, and those that don't follow God on another path. And we learned this early on in the book of Genesis. Genesis chapter 3 says this, I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. Okay? The seed of the woman, in general, are those that follow God. The seed of the serpent are those that follow the devil. Don't follow God, you could say. Now, specifically, this is a prophecy or a promise God gives of the coming of Jesus. Mary becomes the woman who bears the male child that will redeem the world. She is the fulfillment of that promise God made. Okay? But in general, from this point, there are these 2 lines. Godly line and the ungodly line. Those that follow God, those that don't follow God. Okay? And this is the theme that we're going to see through the rest of the story of Scripture. And it's crescendoed in this dramatic vision at the end of the Bible with the woman and the dragon. Because you have the seed of the woman and her descendants, her children, those that follow God and keep his commandments, and the devil and his seed, his offspring, which end up being the two beasts out of the earth and the sea. You see that? That's the story of creation and redemption from the Garden of Eden going forward. That's the exciting story, if you will, that we are a part of. And it began here, and it's just going to keep reiterating itself over and over again. Before I let you go, I want to end with what all of this ends up with. So Genesis chapter 5 shows the godly line of Seth all the way through Noah. And Noah, it says at the end of verse 5, Noah was 500 years old. Noah became the father of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. When men began to multiply on the face of the ground, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were fair, and took to wife such of them as they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide with man forever. He is flesh, and his days shall be 120 years. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. And then he speaks to Noah and tells him, I'm going to wipe out the earth and start all over again. So what happens is that this godly line and ungodly line get merged in such a way that everyone gets corrupted, and no one was without fault on the earth except for one man, Noah. And that's the story that we're going to pick up with next week. So may the Lord bless you and keep you. May he make his face shine upon you and grant you peace. Have a good night.